In 1987, a state social worker named Margaret Chen drove up a mountain road in rural Idaho that hadn't appeared on any map since 1892. She was responding to an anonymous tip about a family living in complete isolation, but nothing could have prepared her for what she found. The Wren family had been living on that mountain for 214 years, completely cut off from the outside world. And when geneticists finally tested their blood, they discovered something that shattered every known principle of human biology. The family should have been extinct within 3 generations due to inbreeding. Instead, they'd grown stronger, healthier, and according to the DNA analysis, were evolving into something that was no longer quite human. The lead geneticist, Dr. Marcus Holland, published one paper on his findings before his research was seized by the Department of Defense. That paper asked a single question that ended his career. What happens to the human genome when it's forced to adapt in complete isolation for 2 centuries, with only 12 original bloodlines, and what were the Wrens adapting to? I've spent 3 years tracking down the answer, interviewing the few surviving family members who were removed from that mountain, obtaining sealed medical records, and uncovering the photographs that the government tried to destroy. What I'm about to tell you isn't just a story about isolation or inbreeding. It's about what happens when human evolution takes a dark turn, when survival demands changes that shouldn't be possible, and when a family's secret becomes too dangerous to let the world know. If this story disturbs you, if it makes you question what you think you know about human genetics and the limits of adaptation, then share it with someone who needs to hear this truth. Subscribe because I have the sealed files from the other families, and yes, the Wrens weren't the only ones. Next month, I'm releasing the full investigation into the Howell clan of West Virginia and what was found in their basement in 2003. But first, let me take you back to 1773, to the founding of the Wren settlement, and to the man whose obsession with genetic purity created a bloodline that would defy nature itself. Ezekiel Wren was a religious extremist even by 1773 standards. A Presbyterian minister from Philadelphia, he became convinced that humanity's connection to God was being corrupted by the mixing of bloodlines, by what he called the pollution of sacred genealogy. He preached that the Garden of Eden represented not just spiritual purity, but genetic purity, and that the only way to return to God's grace was through the careful preservation of chosen bloodlines unmarred by outside corruption. The establishment church declared him a heretic. His congregation called him insane, but 12 families believed him, believed his vision of creating a pure community isolated from the degeneracy of the modern world. In the spring of 1773, Ezekiel led those 12 families into the Bitterroot Mountains of what would eventually become Idaho. They settled on a remote plateau, 7,000 feet up, accessible only by a narrow pass that they immediately fortified. 73 people in total, 31 adults, 42 children, 12 family names: Wren, Blackwood, Cortland, Mercer, Ashford, Bellamy, Thorne, Lockwood, Pritchard, Sterling, Caldwell, and Vance. Ezekiel's plan was simple but horrifying. The community would remain completely isolated from the outside world. No one would leave, no one would enter. Marriages would be arranged carefully within the community to maintain what he called bloodline strength, though what he really meant was controlled inbreeding designed to amplify what he saw as godly traits while eliminating weakness. He kept meticulous records. I've seen them, preserved in the Idaho State Archives after the 1987 discovery. Generation after generation, documented in Ezekiel's precise handwriting, then his sons, then his grandsons. Every birth, every marriage, every death recorded with notes on physical characteristics, mental capacity, spiritual worthiness. For the first 3 generations, the records show exactly what you'd expect from an isolated, inbreeding population: increased infant mortality, birth defects, cognitive impairments, medical problems. By 1823, 50 years after the founding, the population had actually decreased to 61 people despite multiple births, because so many children died in infancy or early childhood. The records from this period are brutal in their honesty. Ezekiel's grandson, Jeremiah Wren, wrote in 1825, "The Lord tests us with weak offspring. 8 children born this year. Only 2 survive their first winter. The blood is not yet pure. We must maintain faith that through careful selection and prayer, the weakness will be cleansed." But then something changed. Something that the records document but cannot explain. Starting around 1830, the death rate began to drop dramatically. Children who should have died from the genetic load of inbreeding not only survived but thrived. By 1840, the population had grown to 93. By 1860, to 147. And the later records show something even stranger. The physical descriptions of family members began to change. Jeremiah's son, Caleb Wren, who became the family patriarch in 1852, maintained even more detailed records than his predecessors. He measured everything: height, weight, skull dimensions, tooth count, finger length. And his records show consistent deviations from normal human averages. The Wren family members were, on average, 6 inches taller than the American norm of that era. Their bone density was 30% higher. Their tooth count averaged 34 instead of 32, with the extra teeth being additional molars that emerged in their late teens. Caleb wrote in 1869, "The children born in recent years possess vigor unknown to our ancestors. They climb the mountain faces with the sureness of goats. They see in darkness that blinds me." Young Rebecca Thorne, age 14, heard the approach of a rockslide from 2 miles distant and saved it. All the purity of blood is manifesting. We are becoming what God intended before the fall. But what's even more disturbing than Caleb's observations is what he didn't write down. What only emerges when you compare the written records to the photographs that survive from the late 1800s. The Wren family started using photography around 1878, when a traveling photographer's abandoned equipment was found by a hunting party and brought back to the settlement. They taught themselves to use it, to develop the plates, to preserve images of their community. And those photographs are wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong in ways that your brain notices before your conscious mind can articulate why. I've seen 47 of these photographs. The Idaho State Archives has them in a sealed collection that I accessed through a FOIA request that took 2 years to process. They finally released them with half the images redacted, and a note that the full collection remains classified for reasons of genetic research security. The photos they did release are disturbing enough. Family portraits from 1880, 1891, 1903, 1915. Large groups of people, 3 and 4 generations together, all wearing the homespun clothing of isolated frontier people. But look at their faces. Really look at them. The proportions are subtly wrong. Eyes set slightly too far apart. Foreheads a fraction too prominent. Jaws that come to points that are almost sharp. And the eyes themselves, even in the degraded black and white photographs, have a reflective quality that shouldn't be possible. A shine like animal eyes caught in light. The children especially. In a group photo from 1891, there are 23 children ranging from infants to teenagers. Every single one of them is staring directly at the camera with the same expression. The same slight smile that doesn't reach their two bright eyes. The same posture, as if they're all being controlled by a single consciousness. One researcher who studied these photos before the classification order came down, Dr. Patricia Yates from UC Berkeley, published a brief analysis in 1989. She noted that the Wren family members showed consistent morphological deviations consistent with both inbreeding depression and, paradoxically, hybrid vigor, a combination that should not be possible in an isolated population. She suggested that either the family records were fraudulent and outside genetic material had been introduced, or something unprecedented in human population genetics occurred on that mountain. Her paper was withdrawn at the government's request. She lost her tenure. She won't talk about the Wrens anymore, but when I tracked her down last year, she told me one thing before closing the door in my face. They weren't inbreeding. Not really. They were breeding with something else. Something that was already on that mountain when they arrived. The records continue through the early 1900s, now kept by multiple family members as the population grew too large for one person to track. By 1920, there were 234 Wrens, and the records show that virtually all childhood mortality had ceased. Genetic defects had disappeared. The family was healthy, thriving, and increasingly strange. Notes from this period mention abilities that sound like folklore, but are documented too consistently across too many independent accounts to dismiss. The Wrens could navigate the mountain in complete darkness. They could predict weather changes days in advance. They could communicate across distances without speaking, knowing when family members were in danger or needed help. And they had stopped aging normally. A census-like document from 1925 lists family members with their birth years, and the math doesn't work. Sarah Blackwood, Wren, born 1851, listed as appearing in her 30th year. Jonathan Cortland, Wren, born 1868, listed as appearing not yet aged beyond young manhood. Multiple entries note that elders remain vigorous well into their 80s and 90s. Something was happening to the Wren family. Something that contradicted everything science understood about genetics, about inbreeding, about human biology itself. And they knew it. A journal entry from 1931, written by Abigail Wren, the great-great-great-granddaughter of Ezekiel, shows clear awareness that the family had become something different. Father says we must never leave the mountain. He says the outside world would not understand what we have become. He says our blood is no longer suitable for mixing with common humanity. Last month, Cousin Thomas expressed desire to leave, to see the cities he had read about in the old books. Father and the elders took him into the deep place. He returned changed, compliant, his eyes reflecting the light like the rest of us. He no longer speaks of leaving. He smiles the family smile and speaks the family words, and I am frightened of what we are becoming, but I am more frightened of the thought of leaving. The mountain owns us now, or perhaps we own it, or perhaps we and it are becoming the same thing. The deep place, that phrase appears 47 times in the later records, always capitalized, always mentioned with reverence or fear. No one ever explains what the deep place is, but context suggests it's a location somewhere in or under the mountain. A place where transformations occur, where family members are taken when they show signs of wanting to leave or when they're deemed ready for some kind of initiation. The last written record from the Wren settlement is dated March 15, 1952, and consists of a single sentence in a shaky hand. The deep place calls us all home eventually, and in its darkness we become one with our ancestors and with the mountain itself, and we are perfect in our unity. After that, the records stop. not because the family died out, but because they apparently stopped seeing the need to document their existence. They'd been isolated for 179 years at that point, 9 generations removed from the outside world, and whatever they had become no longer felt the need to explain itself to the future. They simply existed, hidden on their mountain, following patterns and purposes that the written word could no longer capture. And they might have remained hidden forever, if not for a teenage girl named Ruth Caldwell-Wren who, in February 1987, did something no family member had done in over a century. She left the mountain. She was 17 years old, 8 months pregnant, and terrified of something she wouldn't explain. She made it 12 miles down the mountain before collapsing from exposure and exhaustion on a logging road, where she was found by workers and taken to a hospital in Salmon, Idaho. The hospital staff who treated Ruth documented her condition with growing alarm. She was severely malnourished, but her vital signs were impossibly strong. Her bone density was off the charts. Her teeth included the extra molars that had been noted in the old records. Her eyes had that reflective quality that shows up in photographs, actual tapetum lucidum like a cat's eyes, a feature that doesn't exist in humans. And she was terrified, constantly repeating that she couldn't let them take her baby into the deep place, that she'd seen what happened to the children who went into the deep place, that the family wasn't human anymore, and she had to save her child from becoming like them. She refused to say where she'd come from. She had no identification, no social security number, no record of existence in any database. When they examined her pregnancy, the ultrasound showed a healthy fetus, but with bone structure that the technician described as dense beyond normal parameters. Ruth went into labor 2 weeks after her arrival at the hospital, and what happened during that delivery got the government involved. The baby was born healthy, a girl, normal in most respects except for the bone density and the eyes, and the fact that she was born with a full set of teeth, including molars. That last detail, documented by 3 nurses and 2 doctors, should have been impossible. Human infants aren't born with teeth, and certainly not with adult molars already erupted. But baby doe Caldwell-Wren had them, and she came out screaming and biting, and according to the sealed medical records, it took 3 nurses to restrain an infant less than an hour old, because she had the strength of a toddler. Within 24 hours, federal agents arrived at the hospital. They took custody of Ruth and her baby, and they started asking questions about where she'd come from. Ruth finally told them about the mountain, about the settlement that had existed in isolation since 1773, about the 263 family members still living there, about the changes that had occurred over generations of careful inbreeding, and about the deep place that called every family member eventually. The agents didn't believe her at first, but they did their research, found the historical records of Ezekiel Wren's disappearance with his followers in 1773, found the old land grants that showed property ownership on that remote plateau, found the 19th century photographs in the Idaho archives. On March 23, 1987, a joint task force of FBI, CDC, and military personnel went up that mountain to investigate. What they found was documented in a report that was immediately classified. I've only been able to obtain fragments through various FOIA requests and sources within the agencies involved. But what I've pieced together is terrifying. The settlement was there, exactly where Ruth described it. Dozens of buildings, a community that had existed in complete isolation for over 2 centuries, and 263 people, all looking healthy, all looking similar in that uncanny way that heavily inbred populations do, but stronger, stranger, watching the agents with those reflective eyes that shone in the shadows of their homes. The agents attempted to communicate with the Wrens, to explain that they were offering assistance, medical care, integration into modern society. The Wrens listened politely, those 263 people standing in perfect silence, and then the patriarch, a man in his 90s who looked 40, said simply, "We do not require your assistance. We have transcended the need for the outside world. Return Ruth to us. Return the child. They belong to the mountain." When the agents refused, the Wrens didn't become violent. They didn't argue. They simply smiled, all of them at once, that same smile from the photographs, and began walking away from the settlement, up the mountain, towards something the agents couldn't see. Every single family member, from the oldest to infants being carried by their parents, walking in perfect synchronized silence up into the higher peaks. The agents tried to follow, but the Wrens moved with impossible speed and sure-footedness over terrain that was nearly vertical. Within an hour, all 263 family members had disappeared into the mountain. The agents searched for 3 days. They found the settlement abandoned but intact, found the records that I've referenced, found the photographs, found evidence of a community that had thrived in isolation for over 2 centuries. But they never found the Wrens. And they never found the deep place, though they found evidence it existed. Multiple family members had kept journals that mentioned it. Children's drawings showed a cave entrance marked with symbols. And in the basement of the patriarch's house, they found a tunnel leading down into the mountain, a tunnel that had been hand-carved through solid rock over the course of generations, walls worn smooth by countless hands, going down and down into darkness that their lights couldn't fully penetrate. The tunnel was collapsed about 300 feet in, deliberately sealed with tons of rock that must have been placed from the other side. The Wrens had closed the door behind them. Dr. Marcus Holland was brought in as part of the scientific team to analyze what had been left behind. He was a geneticist from Johns Hopkins, specializing in population genetics and inbreeding depression. He expected to find evidence of massive genetic problems, the inevitable result of 2 centuries of isolation and inbreeding. What he found instead changed his understanding of human genetics forever. The Wrens had left behind blood samples in their primitive medical facility, hair samples, tissue samples from minor medical procedures. Dr. Holland analyzed them all, and his findings were published in one brief paper in the Journal of Human Genetics in June 1988, before the government seized his research and classified everything connected to the Wren family. I have a copy of that paper. It's only 4 pages long, and it's dense with technical language, but the conclusion is clear. The Wren family's genome showed signs of extreme inbreeding, as expected. Massive loss of genetic diversity, long stretches of homozygosity where identical genes were inherited from both parents. The kind of genetic signature that should have resulted in severe inbreeding depression, disease, early death. But overlaying that inbred genome was something else. Dr. Holland called it adaptive introgression of unknown origin, genetic material that wasn't in the original 12 founding families. Genetic material that had somehow been introduced into the Wren genome over the course of 2 centuries. Genetic material that was compensating for the inbreeding, that was making them stronger instead of weaker. But the genetic material wasn't from any known human population. It wasn't even from any known primate population. It wasn't, as far as Dr. Holland could determine, from anything in the current scientific understanding of Earth's genetic database. The paper asks very carefully whether it's possible that the Wren family encountered something on that mountain, something that had been there long before they arrived, something that had its own genetic agenda, and that over 2 centuries of isolation, the Wrens had not just been inbreeding with each other, but had been hybridizing with something else entirely. Dr. Holland suggested that the deep place might be where this hybridization occurred, whether voluntarily or through some kind of environmental exposure, and that the Wrens had not just adapted to their isolated environment, but had become part of it in a way that transcended normal human biology. The paper was published on a Friday. By Monday, Dr. Holland's laboratory had been raided by federal agents. All his samples were seized. His research notes were confiscated. He was informed that his work on the Wren family was now classified under the Atomic Energy Act, a bizarre classification for genetic research that suggested the government considered the findings a matter of national security. Dr. Holland was threatened with imprisonment if he discussed his findings publicly. He never published another paper on the Wrens, but before his research was seized, he made copies. Incomplete copies, fragmented data, but enough to show what he'd discovered. I obtained these copies from a colleague of Dr. Holland's who kept them for 30 years before deciding the world needed to know. And what they show is that the genetic material introgressed into the Wren genome wasn't random. It was targeted. It specifically altered genes related to bone growth, eye development, neural connectivity, metabolic efficiency, and aging. Someone or something was engineering the Wren family at a genetic level, slowly transforming them over multiple generations into something adapted for survival in extreme isolation, for life underground or in darkness, for a lifespan far exceeding normal human parameters. Ruth Caldwell-Wren and her daughter, who was named Hope by the federal agents since Ruth refused to name her, remained in federal custody for 6 months after the mountain expedition. During that time, they were studied extensively. Ruth's genetic analysis showed the same patterns as the samples from the settlement, the mixture of inbred human genome and unknown genetic material. Baby Hope showed even more of the unknown material, suggesting the hybridization was accelerating with each generation. Both mother and daughter showed abilities that couldn't be fully explained. Ruth could navigate perfectly in complete darkness. She could hear frequencies far outside normal human range. Her reaction time was 3 times faster than average. And she knew things she shouldn't be able to know, like when researchers were about to enter her room, or what questions they were going to ask before they asked them. Hope, even as an infant, showed similar abilities plus others. She never cried unless she was genuinely in distress. She responded to verbal commands by 6 weeks old, far earlier than possible for normal infants. By 3 months, she was making eye contact and tracking objects with a focus that suggested far greater cognitive development than should have been possible. The researchers studying them were split between fascination and horror. What were the Wrens becoming? Were they still human in any meaningful sense? And what had they found in the deep place that was transforming them? Ruth finally told them everything in October 1987. She'd been 17, pregnant with her cousin's child, which was normal in the Wren family where everyone was related to everyone else by that point. When she began showing, the elders had congratulated her and told her that when the baby was born, both she and the child would be taken into the deep place for the blessing, as was traditional for new mothers. But Ruth had heard the stories. She'd talked to other young mothers who'd been into the deep place, and they all said the same things. It was beautiful. It was peaceful. It was where they met the old ones who had lived in the mountain long before the Wrens arrived. The old ones were kind and loving and wanted only to help the family become stronger. And after visiting the deep place, the mothers were changed. They stopped asking questions. They smiled that family smile. They moved and spoke in increasing synchronization with the rest of the family. Ruth didn't want to be changed. She'd found some old books in one of the family libraries, books from before the isolation, books that described the outside world, and she wanted her child to have choices that she'd never had. So she ran. She left the only home she'd ever known, left the family that was the only family she'd ever known, left the mountain that called to her even as she fled down its slopes. She'd felt the pull even then, she said. The mountain wanted her back. The deep place wanted her back. The family wanted her back, but she'd kept running for the sake of her unborn child. She told the researchers that the deep place was ancient, far older than the Wren settlement, a network of caverns that went deep into the mountain's core. The old ones lived there, she said, creatures that looked almost human but not quite, tall and thin with too many joints in their limbs and eyes that reflected light and skin that was pale from never seeing the sun. The first Wrens had encountered them within a year of establishing the settlement, found the entrance to their caves, made contact, and the old ones had offered a bargain. The Wrens could stay on the mountain, could live in isolation as they wished, but in exchange, they would become part of the mountain's family. They would mix their blood with the old one's blood, slowly, carefully, over generations. Not through direct reproduction, Ruth said, but through something else. The old ones had a substance, a liquid that glowed faintly in darkness, that they called the blood of the mountain. When consumed, it altered human genetics, slowly incorporating the old one's traits into human DNA. Every family member drank it at certain ceremonies. Infants were given drops at birth. Adolescents drank larger amounts during coming of age rituals. New mothers drank it in the deep place while holding their newborns, passing the changes through breast milk. And over 2 centuries, the Wren family had been transformed from isolated humans into human. Old One hybrids, adapted for life on and in the mountain, stronger and stranger with each generation, until they were more Old One than human. Ruth's testimony was documented in a classified report that I've only seen excerpts from, but those excerpts are chilling. She described the old ones as patient, as thinking in time scales of centuries, as viewing the Wren family as an experiment in hybridization that was progressing beautifully. She said there were other families, too, other isolated human communities across the mountain ranges of America, that the old ones had made similar bargains with, all part of a slow project to create human, Old One hybrids that could exist in both worlds. She said the old ones weren't hostile to humanity, just practical. They'd been in those mountains for thousands of years, maybe longer, and they knew humans would eventually find them. Better to have hybrids who could mediate between the two species, who could protect the old one's secrecy while benefiting from their genetic gifts. Ruth said the family had been happy with the bargain for generations, had seen themselves as chosen, as elevated above common humanity. It was only her generation, exposed to old books and ideas from the outside world, who'd begun to question whether the gifts were worth the loss of humanity. And most of her generation had been taken into the deep place and returned changed, no longer questioning, fully committed to the transformation. Ruth had fled before that could happen to her. She'd saved her daughter from that fate. But at what cost? The government faced an impossible situation. They had evidence of a non-human intelligent species living in American mountains. They had evidence of human, non-human hybridization occurring over centuries. They had 2 living hybrid specimens in Ruth and Hope, and they had no idea how many other isolated communities might be undergoing similar transformations, or how many old ones existed in the vast cave systems that honeycomb the Appalachian and Rocky Mountain ranges. They made the decision to classify everything, to seal all records, to declare the Wren settlement a military exclusion zone, and to monitor Ruth and Hope while trying to decide what to do with them. For 3 years, mother and daughter lived in a government facility, studied but also protected, given comfortable accommodations but denied freedom. Hope grew rapidly, showing development that exceeded normal human children by significant margins. By age 2, she could speak in complex sentences, could read at a 4th grade level, could solve puzzles designed for children twice her age. And she kept asking to go home, kept saying she could hear the mountain calling, kept drawing pictures of the deep place and the old ones who waited there for her. Ruth tried to resist the call, tried to focus on giving her daughter a normal life, but she was fighting against her own biology. The genetic changes didn't just alter physical traits. They altered psychology, created a pull toward the mountain and the deep place that was almost irresistible, a biological imperative to return and complete the transformation. In December 1990, Ruth and Hope disappeared from the government facility. Security footage showed them simply walking out of their rooms, past guards who later reported they'd felt compelled to look away, past locked doors that opened for them, out of the building and into the night. They walked northwest toward Idaho, toward the mountain. A search was launched immediately, but they were never found. The official report says they likely died of exposure in the winter wilderness. But there are rumors, unconfirmed reports from hikers and hunters in the years since, of a woman and a girl living wild in the Bitterroot Mountains, moving with impossible speed through impossible terrain, watching humans with reflective eyes before disappearing into shadows. Some reports say the girl, who would be an adult now, has been seen with others like her, tall and strange and not quite human, moving through the high mountains where the old ones supposedly dwell. The Wren family settlement remains an exclusion zone, officially closed due to hazardous materials, though no hazardous materials have ever been specified. The tunnel to the deep place remains collapsed and sealed. But hikers who ignore the warnings and venture onto that plateau report strange things. The buildings are still there, but are slowly being reclaimed by the mountain. The photographs and records that were left behind have been removed by federal agents. And sometimes, at night, there are lights deep inside the mountain, glowing faintly through cracks in the rocks, and sounds like singing or chanting in voices that harmonize too perfectly to be human. Dr. Marcus Holland never fully recovered from having his research seized. He took early retirement from Johns Hopkins, moved to New Mexico, and spent his remaining years studying genetic abnormalities in isolated populations, always careful to avoid anything that might draw government attention again. He died in 2019, but before his death, he gave an interview to a small genetics journal where he was asked about the Wren family. He said, "I spent my career studying how isolation and inbreeding damage human populations. The Wrens showed me I was asking the wrong questions. Isolation and inbreeding do damage human populations, but what if humans aren't the only variable? What if there are other genetic influences, other species we don't know about, that can compensate for inbreeding, that can redirect human evolution in unexpected directions?" The Wrens weren't defying nature, they were following it. Nature doesn't care about maintaining species purity. Nature cares about survival and adaptation. And if hybridizing with a non-human species living in a mountain gives you survival advantages, then nature will favor that hybridization. The Wrens adapted. They survived. They thrived. The fact that they stopped being fully human in the process is only disturbing to us because we value humanity. Nature doesn't share our values, neither do the old ones, apparently. I've tried to find evidence of the other families Ruth mentioned, other isolated communities that might be undergoing similar transformations. There are candidates. The Howell clan of West Virginia, isolated in the mountains since 1820, who show similar physical characteristics and refuse all contact with authorities. The Merrick family of eastern Kentucky, whose members reportedly have extraordinary night vision and bone density. The Whitmore settlement in the Rockies that appeared on census records until 1950, and then vanished completely. The entire population of 200 people simply gone with no trace. Are these all examples of the old one's long experiment in human hybridization? Are there dozens, maybe hundreds of these hybrid communities scattered through American mountain ranges, slowly transforming into something new, something that bridges human and old one genetics? The government won't confirm or deny any of this. Official responses to FOIA requests return heavily redacted documents or claims that no records exist. but the patterns are there if you look for them. Isolated communities that persist for generations despite inbreeding that should destroy them. Reports of people in remote mountains who look almost but not quite human. Stories of things living deep underground, patient and old, watching and waiting and slowly, over centuries, creating something new. What happened to the Wrens is still happening. Ruth and Hope are presumably back with the family now, if they survived their journey. The 263 family members who walked into the mountain in 1987 are presumably still there, living in the deep place with the old ones, continuing their transformation. And a new generation is being born, even more hybrid than the last, even less human and more adapted to whatever existence awaits them in those deep caverns. The government watches the mountain. Satellites monitor the area. Sensors detect movements and heat signatures deep underground. But they can't stop what's happening because they don't fully understand what's happening. They don't know the old ones' ultimate goals. They don't know how many old ones exist or how extensive their cave systems are. They don't know if the hybrids will eventually emerge and try to integrate with normal human society, or if they'll remain hidden forever, a separate branch of humanity that chose a different evolutionary path. And they don't know what will happen if the transformation continues for another century, another 10 centuries. Will the Wren hybrids eventually become indistinguishable from the old ones? Or will they become something entirely new, a bridge species that's neither human nor old one, but something unprecedented in Earth's evolutionary history? These are the questions that keep me awake at night. These are the questions that got Dr. Holland's research classified and probably got other researchers silenced or worse. Because if the Wrens are real, if the old ones are real, if human, non-human hybridization is happening in isolated pockets across America, then everything we think we know about human uniqueness, about our place in Earth's ecosystem, about our evolutionary history, needs to be reconsidered. We're not alone. We've never been alone. There are other intelligent species sharing our mountains, and they've been conducting genetics experiments on our isolated populations for centuries, slowly creating hybrids, slowly preparing for some future we can't predict. I'm releasing this story now because the government won't. I'm sharing the evidence I've gathered because people deserve to know that humanity's boundaries are more permeable than we think, that evolution doesn't stop with us, and that in the deep places of the world, changes are occurring that will reshape what it means to be human. If you know anyone from isolated mountain communities, especially families that have lived in the same remote location for generations, look at their eyes in the right light. Look at their bone structure. Notice if they move with unusual grace or show abilities they shouldn't have. They might be further along the transformation than the Wrens were. They might be more old one than human already. And they might be part of something vast and ancient and patient. Something that's been preparing for centuries to reveal itself to the world. The Wren family's secret isn't just about one group of isolated religious extremists who defied genetic odds. It's about the old one's quiet conquest of human genetics, achieved not through war or violence, but through patient hybridization with isolated populations over centuries. It's about the fact that deep beneath American mountains, there are things that aren't human, but aren't animals either. Things that think and plan and breed. Things that are slowly incorporating human DNA into their bloodlines, just as they've incorporated their DNA into ours. And it's about the children being born right now in isolated communities across Appalachia and the Rockies. Children with too many teeth and reflective eyes and bones like steel. Children who will grow up hearing the call of the deep place. Children who will eventually walk into the mountains and never return, or return changed, or return as ambassadors of whatever the old ones are becoming. This is the Wren family's shocking secret. This is how centuries of isolation defied nature. By incorporating something that wasn't natural, by accepting the genetic gifts of the old ones, by choosing transformation over extinction. And this is why the government seized the evidence and classified the research and declared the Wren settlement an exclusion zone, not to protect us from the Wrens, but to protect the Wrens from us, to give them time to complete their transformation in peace, to preserve the old one's experiment until it reaches whatever conclusion has been planned for centuries. We think we're the only humans on Earth. We're wrong. The Wrens are human, plus, and there are more of them being born every day, in every isolated mountain community where the old ones have offered their ancient bargain. The transformation is accelerating, the hybrids are multiplying, and soon, very soon, they'll be ready to emerge from their mountains and show the world what humanity can become when it stops being fully human. That's what the Wren family photos really show. Not inbred degeneracy, but the future. Our future, whether we want it or not.